There are people who don't suffer because they are blind to reality, unable to perceive its depths. They suffer precisely because they see too much of it, grasping its intricate layers. Not metaphorically, not merely emotionally, but in a profound psychological sense. These individuals sense what is being hidden long before anyone speaks a word about it, yet no one ever taught them what to do with the intense insights they receive. Carl Jung believed this ability was not a gift in the way most people imagine, something positive and empowering. He believed it was dangerous for their well-being, not because this perception was false or inaccurate, but because it was too true in a world that survives and thrives on not seeing certain harsh realities. Jung did not discover this idea while studying mental illness in patients. He discovered it while observing individuals who were too conscious, too aware of the underlying truths. These were people whose perception had become so refined and acute that it exceeded what social life could tolerate or accommodate. They weren't delusional, unstable, or disconnected from reality in any way. They were simply ahead of it, ahead of the collective pace, and that difference came at a heavy cost no one had warned them about. Jung noticed a strange pattern emerging in his clinical work with various patients. Some individuals possessed what he later described as highly differentiated perception, an advanced form of awareness. They could read micro-expressions without trying or effort, sensed emotional undercurrents before words even formed on lips, and noticed contradictions others unconsciously ignored or overlooked. They saw through social masks effortlessly, piercing the facades people wear daily. But instead of thriving in this clarity, these individuals were often isolated from others, constantly exhausted from the overload, misunderstood by those around them, and labeled as too intense, too sensitive, or difficult without justification. Not because they were wrong in their observations, but because their keen perception disrupted the invisible agreements that keep social life running smoothly and without conflict. Society, Jung believed, does not function on raw truth alone. It functions on shared illusions that everyone tacitly accepts. These are unspoken contracts about what will not be acknowledged or brought to light. We agree, unconsciously and collectively, not to see certain uncomfortable things. We ignore tension to preserve harmony in interactions. We overlook contradictions to maintain a sense of belonging in groups. We accept surface explanations because deeper ones would be destabilizing to our comfort. And when someone walks into a room unable to participate in that silent agreement, something inevitably breaks. Not in them or their psyche, but in the fragile dynamics of the group itself. Jung observed that these individuals often struggled with even the simplest social interactions in daily life. Small talk felt unbearable because it rang so false to their attuned senses. Friendships collapsed under the weight because people felt exposed and vulnerable in their presence. Work environments became hostile and tense because their mere presence disturbed the emotional equilibrium everyone else maintained. Not through direct confrontation or argument, but through their natural clarity of vision. And clarity, Jung realized after careful observation, can be deeply threatening to those invested in illusions. This is where Jung made one of his most unsettling observations about human psychology. When perception becomes too differentiated and sharp, the individual no longer merely observes the unconscious dynamics around them. They begin to absorb it into themselves. He called this phenomenon participation mystique, a term he coined for this process. It is a state where psychological boundaries blur and dissolve, and the individual begins to carry emotional material that does not belong to them, originating from others. They don't just notice anxiety in others from afar, they feel it deeply within. They don't just recognize repression in the air, they absorb it into their own psyche. Over time, their own inner world becomes crowded with foreign elements, confused by the mix, and heavy with unprocessed weight. These individuals often report a strange exhaustion that even deep sleep doesn't fix or alleviate, because the fatigue is not physical from bodily exertion, it's psychic from constant overload. They are constantly processing emotional data and undercurrents that others never even register on their radar. And because no one around them acknowledges or validates this intense reality they experience, they begin to question themselves deeply. Am I imagining this tension? Am I too sensitive to handle normal life? Is something fundamentally wrong with me? Jung was clear and unequivocal on this point. Nothing was wrong with them or their perception, but something essential was missing in their journey, the crucial process of integration to balance and harness their gifts.
If seeing too much were the real problem, nature would have corrected it. But Jung didn't see this ability as a flaw. He saw it as a threshold. This is a point in psychological development where consciousness moves faster than the collective can follow. Jung knew evolution does not care if you are comfortable. It cares if consciousness advances. Carl Jung believed that individuals with highly differentiated perception appear before society is ready for what they perceive. They are not anomalies. They are precursors, but precursors are rarely welcomed. Jung observed that once perception reaches a certain level, the psyche faces a critical fork. One path leads to fragmentation, the other to individuation. The difference between the two has nothing to do with intelligence, morality, or intention. It has everything to do with structure. The first danger Jung identified was psychological isolation, not social isolation, but existential isolation. When you perceive realities others cannot tolerate, conversation becomes shallow and relationships become constrained. You begin to live in a world that feels slightly out of sync with everyone else's, and over time, something inside you begins to withdraw. Not because you hate people, but because being constantly misunderstood erodes the will to explain. Jung called this the problem of the superior function, when your greatest strength becomes the source of your deepest suffering. And here is where many people break. They begin to identify entirely with what they see, becoming the observer, the one who knows, the one who understands. This feels empowering at first, but it is a trap. Jung warned repeatedly about psychological inflation. The moment the ego identifies with an archetypal function, it loses balance. Seeing clearly does not make you whole. Being able to name unconscious patterns does not mean you have integrated them. When perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function, and that is not individuation, it is possession. The second danger Jung observed was even more severe: identity dissolution. Highly perceptive individuals often absorb so much emotional and psychological material from others that they lose contact with what is actually theirs. They mistake absorbed anxiety for their own, carry grief that doesn't belong to them, and confuse collective tension with personal failure. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with the unconscious of their environment. He warned that this state, if prolonged, can lead to what he called psychic annihilation, not death, but loss of self. This is why Jung insisted that perception without individuation is genuinely dangerous, not symbolically, but clinically. But Jung did not stop there, because he also observed something else, something hopeful. He noticed that some individuals with the same depth of perception did not collapse. They did not withdraw permanently. They did not become bitter. They did not lose themselves. Instead, they changed how they related to what they saw. They learned to hold perception instead of being flooded by it. This was the birth of what Jung called conscious integration,